Today is the day after Christmas, and I'm taking a short break from family festivities, which at the moment means Mario Kart with the kids, to record a short episode. An episode about how Walt Disney celebrated the holidays at his house. Walt didn't talk much about Christmas. His daughters Diane and Sharon repeatedly explained that Christmas was a big event at their home, with lots of presents and parties. But Walt, when speaking in interviews, was more likely to talk about a Christmas release such as Snow White or the importance of the holiday season for promoting his films. At times he would point to the early hand-sewn Mickey Mouse dolls released as a Christmas item, or the scale model Mickey and Minnie railroad handcar released by the Lionel Corporation, which sold over 1 million units, also a Christmas item. But there are some sections in letters and interviews where he does touch down on Christmas as he experienced it with his family and friends. Today, we're going to take a look at Christmas at Walt Disney's house. But this past week, in going through interviews and letters, as I pulled out sections that pertain to the Disney family Christmas, I started to notice a theme. Most of the stories here are focused around a common occurrence. Most of them are focused on gifts that Walt gave, or at least tried to give, to others. Walt Disney came from a working-class home, a home where his parents often struggled financially. Walt's younger sister, Ruth, recalled that in the early 1900s and 1910s, quote, "We had a Christmas tree. We'd go out and cut a Christmas tree and we'd decorate it all with popcorn and thought it was wonderful." On that tree, too, were strings of cranberries that once the holidays were over, Walt's mother, Flora, would use to make a sauce. In thinking about his childhood, Walt was often focused on the struggles. Quote, "Everything my parents gave me," he said, "was something practical, something I needed for Christmas and birthdays. Now my brother Roy was the one who would always see that Ruth and I had a toy. Roy didn't have much money, but by gosh, he always saw we had a toy. Roy was one of the kindest fellows I've ever known." But there was one Christmas, likely when Walt was 15, where he wanted boots, something that allowed him to fit in more with kids whose families had slightly more money. Quote, "The kids were all wearing boots, then I wanted a pair of those. I had shoes and things, but those boots were something extra. And I had quite a time, kept pounding my folks to get me a pair of these boots. Finally, I got a pair at Christmas. I mean, I'd hound them all year. They'd always wait and give them to me for Christmas or my birthday. My birthday came close to Christmas, so I was so proud of those boots. They were high boots that came up and laced, and there was a strap that came across." In another interview, Walt said, quote, "It was like a dream come true. Now I could swagger among my young friends with proper pride." It was out of that sense of hardship that, at least according to his sister, that Walt found an early sense of generosity. While delivering papers for his father, Walt found small ways to make extra money on his route. Again, according to his sister Ruth, quote, "I remember one Christmas. I don't know how Walt got the money to buy it for me, and I was just overwhelmed because here he was, just a little kid, and he gave me a big pink hair ribbon bow and something else, and I just couldn't imagine how he got enough money to buy me 2 gifts." Though Walt Disney spent his boyhood in the Midwest, in Chicago, Marceline, and Kansas City, he moved in 1923 to Los Angeles, where he slowly developed a successful animation studio. In the mid-1930s, Walt brought his childhood friend Walt Pfeiffer out to the studio, a person he had known in Kansas City. By this time, Pfeiffer, like Walt, had moved away from Kansas City. For years, Pfeiffer had been in Chicago working as an art director. But when he arrived in California, he soon discovered that other artists, quote, were so good at drawing that they drew rings around me. While Snow White was in production, Pfeiffer worked in the studio's story department, but later he became involved in the management end of the company. But that initial Christmas, with Pfeiffer far from home, Walt invited him over to the house to spend some time with him and Lillian. Their visit also involved a late-night long-distance phone call that, back in the mid-1930s, not only would have been expensive, but also would have taken an operator, or more likely multiple operators, to personally connect Walt's home in California by physically making connections through plugs and switches to a home late at night in Kansas City. Quote, "The first year I was out here," Pfeiffer said, "I was lost coming out from Chicago. I left all my friends back there. I didn't know anyone. And I was living at the Hollywood Athletic Club. Walt invited me to their home for Christmas Eve. We'd have a few drinks, and as it neared midnight, he said, 'Let's call up your dad in Kansas City.' I said, 'Great.' You know, we were whooping it up. Lily had gone to bed and left us in the library. So we got Dad on the phone, and we started singing the Deutsch Grinlanders. This was a German song that my dad had taught us. My dad was half German and half Irish. He got a big kick out of it. We got him out of bed, and he got the biggest kick out of that. He always talked about it afterwards when I'd come home. Just to think that Walt thought so much of him to do that." One of the most famous Disney family Christmas stories involves a dog that Walt and Lily had shortly after they were married. While developing his studio, Walt tended to work late. As a new husband, he also noticed that his wife Lily spent a great deal of her time by herself, often at night. Walt, perhaps out of a sense of guilt, thought that his wife would enjoy a dog as a companion, as Walt himself loved dogs. At this point in his life, he was finding small pieces of success with a new character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which was made by Walt's studio but distributed by Universal. In 1927, once Walt and Lily had moved into their first house, a small model on Lyric Avenue, with his brother Roy living right next door, Walt thought he would purchase a dog, only there was one problem. Quote, "My wife would have nothing to do with dogs," he said. "For some reason, she didn't like dogs. She said, 'Oh, they get hair on everything. They're dirty and there's dog odors.' So I got a book that had to do with dogs, and I kept reading about different dogs, and finally I had the story of the Chow. The Chow did not shed hair. The Chow does not have fleas. The Chow has very little dog odor." And I read this story to her about the Chow, and she said, "Well, if I had to have a dog, that's the kind of dog I would want." That's all I wanted. The next day I went out and bought a Chow and kept it under wraps until Christmas. Bought it when it was about 6 to 8 weeks old, and it was about a month before Christmas. And I kept it under wraps until Christmas, and Christmas Eve. We had our Christmas tree, and her sister would come over, and her little niece was about 11 then. And the niece was always the one who took the presents around and gave them to everybody. We had kind of a little family Christmas. What I did, I picked up my Chow from the dog kennel in the afternoon. I took it over and kept it at Roy's. I got a big hat box. I got a big ribbon on it. When the time came, I went over, put the little puppy in that hat box, tied it up with a ribbon, and when they were all busy, put it over by the tree. And my niece was tipped off, so my wife didn't see me bring it in. So then my niece went over and got this, and she said, "Oh, who's this for?" And it said, "To Lily from Santa Claus." So she brought this big hat box over and put it in front of my wife. And my wife said, "Oh, Walt, you didn't." Now, she didn't know I'd bought a dog. She thought I'd bought her a hat, and that's one thing she doesn't want anybody to do. She wants to buy her own hats, you know. I mean, some husbands will buy dresses. Well, they like to buy their own, and she was upset because I had bought her a hat. So when she started to open it, it moved, and she let out a scream, and then she was really kind of upset. And when she opened it, this little chow stuck its head out of there. And from that time on, that was her baby. I've never seen anybody so crazy over an animal, and my gosh, she wouldn't let it out of her sight. It had to sleep in our bedroom. Lillian, too, recalled the dog with warmth. Quote, "I didn't want a dog because I'd never had a dog," she explained decades later. Walt left it over to Roy and Edna's place, and he brought it in at Christmas in a hat box with a big red bow on it. I've loved that thing ever since. But I didn't want to have a dog because I didn't want to clean up after it. And I love this thing so much. They named the dog Sonny. It soon became a central member of Walt's small family. It went with him on drives. It went to the studio. When Walt went out for ice cream, he also bought the dog a scoop. And the story of that dog in the hat box as a Christmas gift would be the one that Walt carried with him for years, a story that was later incorporated into the opening sequence of Lady and the Tramp. In the 1930s and 1940s, Walt's daughters Diane and Sharon remember elaborate gifts that Walt gave them, toys and books and clothes. But there was one gift that stood out from the rest, a playhouse built by studio craftsmen in their backyard not far from the pool. Picture the Seven Dwarfs cottage in Snow White, complete with a curved roof and chimney, only shrunk down to perfectly fit two girls. Walt's wife Lillian recalled that, quote, "We had the studio build that, and it was their Christmas present, and it was the sweetest thing. It had a little picket fence around it, and they could have looked out the window and seen it, but we kept them away from it, and it was all furnished, had a little telephone in it, and everything." But this story is most interesting from the perspective of Walt's older daughter, Diane. "One Christmas, Santa Claus brought us a playhouse," Diane said, "and I just knew that Santa Claus did because it just appeared Christmas morning out in our backyard. It was this darling little playhouse. It was a little one room about the size of a good-sized closet, but it had little lead glass windows and one of those little mushroom chimneys on it. Though there was no fireplace and a sink with running water, it had a little tank inside the cooler that you could fill, then turn on the faucet and the water would come out. And it had a telephone in it that would connect with our house in the kitchen. And I talked to Santa Claus on it the morning. We had a big fat butler at the time, and it must have been him that I talked to. But he asked me if the house was all right, and I said, 'Yes, Santa, fine.' I was afraid to speak. My eyes were about probably as big as saucers because I knew it was Santa and I knew he had brought the house." And a little boy next door was sort of cynical about it. I said to him, "Well, Morgan, look what Santa brought." And he said, "Santa Claus." He said, "You're crazy." He said, "There were men in your front yard all day yesterday putting the house up." I said, Morgan, you're a liar. I was out in the front yard playing all day long and there were no men." But I was so positive. I remember it. I couldn't have been more positive that Santa had brought that house. It was really a wonderful thing. And then there was the gift that Walt tried to give Peter Ellenshaw. Only Ellenshaw's sense of decorum and British sensibilities prevented him from accepting it. Peter Ellenshaw, an extremely talented matte painter who was from England, first worked on Disney films such as Treasure Island. These early projects were shot in England, but then, based on his impressive work, he was invited to work on other Disney projects in California. In 1953, the first of these projects was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Ellenshaw and his wife and their son Harrison flew to California, where they stayed at a small hotel just off Ventura Boulevard while they looked for a house. Even in 1953, the area around Ventura Boulevard wasn't the most family-friendly section of town. And this is a story of Walt trying to offer a gift to brighten Ellenshaw's holiday, but also a story about Ellenshaw being so nervous to make a good impression now that he was in California that Walt simply, despite many attempts, wasn't able to connect. It started with an invitation for Ellenshaw to bring his son over to Walt Disney's house so that Harrison, who would have been 8 years old in 1953, could have ridden the scale model railroad that Walt had in his enormous backyard. Quote, "It was Christmas time," Ellenshaw explained. "We were living in that cruddy little motel I told you about earlier. Walt being Walt called me, and I had missed him. I had been somewhere, I can't remember. Anyway, his secretary said he wanted you to come over and bring Harrison over to run the train. I would have loved to have gone, and I thought I had missed a wonderful opportunity. Thank heaven next week, Walt said, I missed you last week. Come over to the house." Even though it was Christmas Eve, the three of us went over there. He had also invited Dick Fleischer, the director of 20,000 Leagues, and a whole lot of other people, and they were riding Walt's train in the backyard. At that time, being English with children who did what they were told or else, I had trouble with these kids who were yelling, "Hey, Walt, give us another ride." I thought, gee, these kids shouldn't talk to Walt like that. Walt came to me and said, "Stay around until these people leave." So I stayed around. Meantime, Harrison had met up with Walt's wife's niece's son, and they were up to no end of mischief. Anyway, Walt came to me after everyone had left and said, "Would you like to drive the train?" He had me sit on this damn train. I didn't want to drive Walt Disney's train, for heaven's sakes. I was afraid that I would be blamed if something went wrong. "I'd love to, sir," I said. Boy, the power of that little thing. I rode about 10 yards and got off chicken-like. I was too scared. Others had taken it all the way around, but I wasn't going to do that. Then Walt said, "I'd like you to see the house. Have you ever seen the house?" Of course I hadn't seen the house. He was dressed with his cap pulled up. Americans look so funny when they're playing with their trains. Walt had this train cap, but the peak was turned up, and he was dressed like a train driver. He was filthy dirty. We went upstairs to see Diane's room, which was in a state of upheaval. Poor girl, she would have died if she had known we were looking at it. "She's out with a kid who plays with the Rams. They might get married," said Walt. They did, of course. We went around all the rooms in the damn house, came downstairs, and he showed us all the paintings and everything. Mrs. Disney came in and with a cold voice said, "Walt, aren't you dressed yet?" and looked at us as if, "What the hell are you still doing here?" kind of thing. Why were we stopping her husband from getting ready? Walt smiled. "Would you like to stay and visit with our friends?" I thought I had better be careful. No good getting that close to the boss, you know, bad business. "I'm sorry, sir, we have to go." Then Walt said, "Before you go, why don't you come down to Palm Springs? I've got a place down there." He knew we were all alone in that cruddy little motel, so that was why he was doing all this. He was so human, but would act gruff because he didn't want you to think he was that way. Well, we didn't, because Bobby wasn't feeling too well the next day. Just as well. You can't go too far by being a sycophant. It doesn't work. Each Christmas, Walt wrote a letter to his sister Ruth. The letters were probably dictated to his secretary, who cleaned them up a little, but they each show how Walt's interests were changing through the years. In the 1940s, the letters were focused almost entirely on the films he was creating at the studio. In the early 1950s, Walt talked about Disneyland, but in the late 1950s, the letters from Walt focused more on his grandchildren and also how he felt about aging. Walt was close to his sister. She was 2 years younger than him, and they nearly shared a birthday. He was born on December 5th, 1901, and she was born on December 6th, 1903. This letter is dated December 6th, 1958. It seems to me, Walt wrote, that you and I have become another year older with unusual swiftness. It couldn't have been a year since I sent birthday wishes to you, but the calendar says so, and here I am again. Speaking of Christmas, little Joanna and Tammy gave us a chuckle the other day. I should say another chuckle because our grandchildren managed to keep us smiling most of the time. Anyway, Joanna and Tammy asked for guns and holsters for Christmas. Lily thought she hadn't heard right. We weren't surprised that this was Chris's wish, but it seemed to these old-fashioned grandparents that the little gals should want dolls, but guns it is. I guess little girls made of sugar and spice are things of the past. Although, in spite of the desire for guns, Joanna prefers skirts to blue jeans. Sharon has sore feet from trying to find an Annie Oakley outfit for her. And by the early 1960s, the number of grandchildren at Walt's house was quickly increasing as both Diane and Sharon started families. Quote, "They are the light of my life," Walt said. "The eldest, who is 8, walked up to me the other day after looking at one of my shows on television and pointed a finger in my face. 'I know who you are. You are Walt Disney.' I'd been discovered. I was suddenly more than just a grandpa, and believe me, that meant something. Most grandchildren, the age of mine, are always running to someone with skirts on. But I have a kind of hold over Grandma Disney now. My grandchildren began to suspect I was a little different when I took them to Disneyland a while ago. They realized that Grandpa could take them anywhere he pleased without being questioned or having to pay." Walt's wife Lillian recalled that Walt, as he got older, was often more comfortable at the studio when everyone together was working on a film or a project for the park, and that it was a struggle for him to spend many days socializing with friends and families. This last piece is a story of an unlikely food fight that comes from Lillian Disney and likely takes place in the late 1950s or the early 1960s, as their daughter Sharon and her first husband, Bob Brown, are part of the story. By this time, with Walt in his 60s, the parties were smaller and the gatherings around the holidays slightly less grand. Quote, "When Walt got through with the festivities," Lillian explained, "he went to his room and read usually. He never wasted time. He liked to set up the children's toys as he did the train one year, but he couldn't just sit and visit with people. Sometimes he would be annoyed by something he was served. He didn't like cake. One time Thelma made a whipped cream cake, and Walt was complaining about it. I got so put out that I picked up a piece of the whipped cream and threw it at him. It hit him right in the face, and he picked up some whipped cream and threw it at me. Then we started throwing it back and forth at each other, and Bob and Sharon, I remember, were having dinner with us. They looked at each other wondering what on earth was going on." At about this same time, perhaps a season or two later, Walt, in his yearly Christmas letter to Ruth and her son Teddy, explained, "I may not be getting as excited over studio going-ons as I once did, but I haven't hit the rocking chair either. No, sir. As a matter of fact, I bought myself a jazzy little sports car this year, a Mercedes 230 SL. That probably won't mean much to you, but I'll bet Hetty will know it. Anyway, it's just the car for the man who thinks young, and I'm the guy for it. I thought for a while I was going to have to fight Sharon for possession of it. I loaned it to her one week while we were away, and she threatened to steal it. But less than 2 years after that, after writing that letter and talking about how he was wired in small ways into his youth, Walt was gone, leaving behind gifts and holiday memories that echo around us through time in books and films and podcasts like the one we have today. I'm heading back now to play Mario Kart with the kids, where I'll be lucky to come in third. But I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.